I've intended to do an episode on Subaltern Studies for a while, but there was a pandemic and Subaltern Studies and the history of medicine intersect in ways that made me uncomfortable discussing the questions at that time. So this episode is as much about why I didn't do an episode as it is about Subaltern Studies. Let me start with what Subaltern Studies is. Subaltern Studies was an irregular series of collected papers, the first volume of which was published in 1982. Initially, the volumes were edited by Ranajit Guha, who wrote a short introduction to the first volume outlining the group's goals. The papers in general focused on modern Indian history, particularly the period of the nationalist struggle against British occupation. They drew on a variety of Marxist inspirations. The term subaltern comes from the writings of the Italian Marxist Gramsci, and there are similarities with E.P. Thompson's History from Below. Guha's introduction begins with a critique of elitist historiography. Elitist historiography is a very common way of conceptualizing history. It's often associated with Carlyle, the idea of great men making history, and occasionally exceptional women. That if you tell the story of these particularly gifted people, if you write history biographically, their drives and characters, you've identified the motive force in history. The concept of elitist historiography has been, because basically it's simplistic nonsense, under sustained attack amongst historians for well over a century. A good example of this is, again from a Marxist point of view, found in Bertolt Brecht's poem Questions from a Worker Who Reads, which begins, "Who built Thebes of the seven gates? In the books stand the names of kings. Did they then drag up the rock slabs?" It's a point that bears repeating, often and frequently. Great men do not make history. History is made primarily by the collective action of the many, not the outstanding achievements of the few. Guha repeats much the same criticism in his opening remarks when he writes, "The historiography of Indian nationalism has for a long time been dominated by elitism, colonialist elitism, and bourgeois nationalist elitism. Both these varieties of elitism share the prejudice that the making of the Indian nation and the development of the consciousness of nationalism which informed that process were essentially the result of a contest between Nehru, Gandhi and other nationalist leaders and British colonial politicians and administrators." Remember those pictures of the nationalist struggle I showed a few moments ago? Yeah, Gandhi is always at the centre of those images when you search for them. And that, felt Guha and others, misrepresented the agency at work in the struggle. It's the crowd, not the person at the centre, who is really driving the action. However, if that were the sole insight the subaltern group offered, it would not amount to much as historical insights go. But to this old and well-worn critique, the subaltern added some interesting concepts. One of these is the idea of popular politics as an autonomous domain. This is the idea that a mass protest or insurgency might arise neither from the oppression of the colonial state, i.e. in a reactive sense to halt some injustice, nor as a result of agitation from a native intelligentsia, but organically from a variety of social bonds and political ideas that were coherently articulated by the people themselves, ideas that may not even be known to or understood by the elites through whom we understand the period. And this idea of an autonomous domain is both what makes the best of subaltern studies really good. They show that by understanding popular movements on their own terms, you can gain insights into historical events. In fact, you gain some insights simply by accepting that an autonomous domain exists at all, that people involved in a riot or a protest are not merely being riled up or venting their anger, or the victims of agents provocateurs. But it's also the root of the disconnect and discomfort that I'm going to talk about today. Something Guha and his successors were never quite satisfactorily able to answer is what exactly the subaltern is. Etymologically, it's a term for a junior officer in an army. In Gramsci, it's just a cipher for worker or proletariat, which he used to avoid censorship. But when it gets deployed in connection with the need to recover an autonomous domain, the term subaltern implies a group who are silenced, a group that is excluded from our official records because they are only ever talked about, they never get to talk for themselves. Though nobody within the group ever uses that silencing to form a coherent definition of whether or not a group is subaltern. Some subaltern writers saw the recovery of this silenced group's own agency and thoughts as the central goal of subaltern studies, often drawing an implicit parallel between the way the colonial state and nationalist leaders silenced the bulk of Indian people with the way academics silenced the subjects of their study. In this connection, Gyanendra Pandey writes, "The privileged discourse of modern times has been the discourse of the expert, the social worker, the judge, the medical scientist, the historian. Their authority and the praise of their expertise has expanded over the last 2 centuries at the cost of other voices, other truths." Yeah, rejection of experts and other truths has some uncomfortable resonances with popular politics, and there is an element of that I'm going to be talking about. But it's complicated because the subaltern group's politics lean heavily liberal, left-wing, and intellectual. It also raises some very practical problems for the historian. If the subaltern are silenced, recovering their voices is hard. If the bulk of our sources reflect the words, thoughts, and agency of colonial officials or native elites, and we presume those people did not understand the subaltern's experience any more than we do, then it's hard for the bulk of scholarship not to reflect those perspectives. You can only study the evidence that survives. And while there are some exceptional pieces of early work, subaltern writers soon began to fall back on theoretical readings of the very elite sources they had initially rejected. Their writings often devolved into inaccessible theory, and the group has been widely accused of losing its way in its encounters with postmodernism. However, it is the degree to which subaltern studies raises uncomfortable questions that I want to focus on today, because it's the reason that I didn't do an episode on subaltern studies 2 years ago. One of the areas that subaltern studies found fruitful was the study of medicine. Resistance to colonial medical interventions provided an ideal ground where oral history, the bureaucratic state, popular autonomous systems of thought, and colonial or elite interests and ideologies all intersected and were often recorded in considerable detail. And history of medicine is one of the last unapologetic bastions of elitist historiography. Popular accounts of the history of medicine are still taught in terms of great men making discoveries and altering the shape of human history. The paradigmatic example being Edward Jenner's invention of the first vaccine, derived from cowpox in 1796, which, so the story goes, led directly to the complete worldwide eradication of smallpox in the 1970s. Unquestionably, whatever its actual historical motivations, one of the great human achievements. And I remember being taught that story in exactly those terms as a major part of my early schooling. But in the second half of the 20th century, people seriously working on history of medicine began to realise that major public health successes had a lot less to do with scientific discovery and were rarely motivated by altruism. And I'm going to show an example of this, a very well-known one with regard to smallpox in London. And forewarned, hear out the whole explanation, because it's not what it superficially seems, and it will be very obvious very quickly why I did not want to do this episode during the response to the COVID pandemic. Good records survived for London for deaths from smallpox for several centuries, and it took me only a few minutes online to find 2 charts of those deaths from 2 relatively recent articles. They're all drawn out of the same corpus of official records, one of which, handily and conveniently for this discussion, marks Jenner's invention of the vaccine. I've used inverted commas because the concept was very obviously widely known before Jenner came along. That invention does not seem to make any difference. But it's not the historical event I want to focus on. In the 1850s, the British government began to make smallpox vaccination compulsory. Again, nothing really happens in this data. But resistance to smallpox vaccines is substantial. People are willing to risk fines, jail, to prevent their children receiving it. And that resistance splits along class lines, with the urban working class, who are not uncoincidentally becoming more politically influential at this point, being particularly opposed. It becomes a political flashpoint, and eventually the government gives in. Around 1900, they begin to roll back the compulsory element, and smallpox vanishes. That's right, 50 years after a compulsory vaccination scheme was introduced, smallpox was still endemic. 50 years after it was ended, smallpox had effectively been eradicated in the UK, and some 20 to 30 years after that, worldwide. And yes, everything about the anti-vax movements in the late 19th century sounds just like the delusional, self-absorbed, idiotic conspiracy theory twaddle spouted by anti-vax movements in the 21st century. But so does much of the moralising condescension of the people who advocate vaccines, who seem more concerned to demonstrate that certain sections of society are not competent to make their own decisions than they are to actually improve public health. And I have a really good example of this from an article by Durbar that looks at those debates. He quotes a newspaper poem satirising anti-vaccination sections of the working class, known at the time as conscientious objectors. I conscientiously object to vaccinating me kid. In vaccination as a check, I don't believe and never did. I do believe it's been imposed. The working classes too annoy, and that why I ain't disposed to try it on me girl or boy. I says me girl or boy because I don't know if it's he or she. My old woman here is pos that it's a girl, so let it be. But what she's called I couldn't say. I know my wife is called the same. I think it's Rose or Kate or May. Seems to be an episode for poetry, doesn't it? Now we can see with distance that poem is not intended to convince, but rather to ridicule. It clearly feeds into and reflects attitudes that justify unwarranted social intrusions, directed against particular bits of society the writer looks down on. And importantly, it denies the subject that it talks about any genuine motivation to their actions. Their actions are an arbitrary consequence of ignorance. And the conclusion of almost all serious scholarship is that the motivation behind public health measures throughout human history has always been more political than altruistic or scientific, which is pretty uncomfortable when, as I expect, pretty much everyone in my audience is going to be sitting on the same side of the pro-science fence when it comes to masks, lockdowns and vaccines. And if you're new to the channel, let me just be really clear about this. Anything that sounds even a little bit like a conspiracy theory in the comments is going to be instantly deleted. Okay, I did ask you to bear with me, but I think it's time to explain why vaccination isn't making any difference. The answer is not that vaccines don't work, but that something else is so important that it swamps any effect the early and relatively unsophisticated vaccines would have. And that much more important factor is poverty. Industrialising urban spaces in the 19th century were unbelievably poor. It's genuinely hard to imagine the squalor from the perspective of our relatively affluent societies. I think, in all honesty, just how bad it was would have been shocking to pre-modern rural societies. And fundamentally, it was the poverty that was killing people. They were malnourished, overcrowded, lacked clean water, job security or basic sanitation. So the most basic preventive measures like isolation, hydrating or simple rest were impossible. And that is what changed. Western Europe began to eliminate poverty at the end of the 19th century, not out of altruism, though a great deal of altruistic feeling was tapped to do it, but because of vested interests, the one of which was that competing governments were increasingly dependent on mass conscription for military power, and on political parties and mass support to gain power. That is what stopped endemic smallpox. Yes, the vaccines will have helped, but it was the massive change in social structure which had the real impact, and that is why nothing on the chart lines up with the history of vaccines. But the period of gradual diminution falls between the Napoleonic and the Boer Wars, and the moment when smallpox effectively disappears coincides with the foundation of the Labour Party. Because the history of medicine is a history of social change and realpolitik, not a history of elite achievements. As I said, history of medicine was a major part of the subaltern group's work. It was an obvious point of intersection where their interests. David Arnold, for example, who was a substantive contributor over the years, penned a number of works on the intersection between colonialism and medicine that approach it in exactly this sort of critical way. But as we can see, this can lead to uncomfortable questions when we think about it. Okay, let me interject here to say I don't know how to finish this episode. I've actually recorded several different versions of the ending. I've talked about the question of self-censorship. I don't regret at all making the decision not to do an episode on the subaltern 2 years ago. I feel it's always responsible to think about what your words will mean to the people who are listening to them, and what this discussion would have meant 2 years ago just wasn't helpful. I thought about talking about why this particular sort of thing makes me personally uncomfortable, which is the connection between modern politics. The subaltern take on a heroic guise when they're elevated to protagonists in the story of India's independence, when their agency, not that of writers or politicians, shapes event. But that simple moral economy does not work in every situation. The autonomous domain is rife with gender discrimination, communal violence, anti-scientific rhetoric, religious fanaticism, and basic ignorance. And it's much harder to feel sympathetic when you recognise the category in your own time, in the form of Trumpists, Brexiteers, anti-vaxxers, climate change deniers, and right-wing online trolls. And of course, that I would be on the wrong side of the history that the subaltern are talking about. The historians are never subaltern. By definition, a historian can't be subaltern. A historian is somebody who is speaking, and a subaltern is somebody who is silenced. Historians are always speaking from the elitist point of view. In terms of colonialism, had I lived 100 years ago, I would almost certainly have felt far greater sympathy for colonial administrators than for nationalist mass movements. But the honest answer is, there's no easy or neat way to wrap up this discussion, precisely because it's a discussion about why I found questions uncomfortable, and that uncomfortable questions tend to come up when you look at the subaltern analysis. And the questions wouldn't be uncomfortable if they could be answered easily in a 15-minute episode on YouTube. So I'm basically going to leave the episode here, and I'm going to give you what I think are 2 or 3 main takeaways. The Subaltern Studies group is important to historiography, to the methods that historians deploy. And autonomous domain, the idea that there are people, agents, who affected the course of history in the past, whose voices have been completely silenced, is a really important insight that they gave. And history is never an entirely distanced, remote, objective practice. There are always going to be occasions when you work on something and it creates a resonance with your current world, that is going to make you uncomfortable, and you shouldn't hide from that. So thank you for listening, and next episode, hopefully something a little bit lighter.